All right, everybody, I guess we'll go ahead and get started. So thanks for coming to the very first of the, what do we actually call the Civility and Politics? Political Differences in Civility. So I'm Alan Tomei, I'm the chair of the Philosophy and Religious Studies Department, and I'm the moderator here. And my role, if everything goes properly, is to simply keep track of time and remind them that they need to shut up at certain times as we go through things, so the other person can talk. I used a very high-tech method of writing in whiteboard marker on paper, so they have those things. So if you see me throw those out, that's what I'm doing. I'm not actually trying to assault them with paper cuts or anything. It's just telling them what the time is, okay? We're going to flip a coin shortly. Dr. Fuller assures me that some of you are used to him flipping coins to figure out tests, so that there's a coin out there in the audience somewhere. So if there is one, we'll use your coin. Otherwise, I have an app that we can use. But I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we'll flip a coin to figure out which one of these articles we're actually going to discuss first. And there we have one. But I'll go ahead and pass it on. So.
Okay. Wait, we have to flip
You're
a coin?
introducing.
Oh, introducing ourselves. Okay. So most of you know me already, but for those that don't, I'm Dr. Adam Fuller in the Department of Politics and International Relations.
I'm Michael Jerryson. I'm a professor in religious studies in the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. I want to thank everyone here today. Dr. Fuller and I decided to come together with this because, I'm a self-professed leading liberal and self-identified conservative, and we thought that as both educators, more concerned about education than our political differences, we thought that what we could do is learn more about each other's positions on this, not try to win out, but to learn about our other viewpoints in this way. And in doing so, try to showcase how we can have discussions about different politics and not be each other's throats like we see often in television.
Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really what a university ought to be, a place where we can have this kind of civil dialogue. So I want to thank Dr. Jerryson for joining me here today.
So real quick before we flip a coin, there is a sheet of paper going around for those that might have come in after I said that was going on. We only made 15 copies of each article. So if you want to make sure you can get a copy of the article, make sure you put your name and email address down, and we'll send you a link with that.
There is a Google Drive link, though, is online. If is it on the flyer?
It's not on the flyer.
But we can put the link on the YSU Philosophy Studies Club Facebook page, the link to for the Google Drive that has free availability for both these readings for you to use.
So another option. And then also, the next one of these will be April 17th. There is no topic yet for that one, correct?
Right.
And so that'll be announced whenever the two of them come up with it. And so hopefully you all can come back and join us again. So
The question, though, for today's discussion, though, is whether or not the countercultural revolution in the United States in the 1960s was helpful to the United States.
Right.
And so for this measure, we decided for the parameters that we would each choose a short reading that was peer-reviewed, meaning it went through a process of having people experienced and educated, assessing the level of the quality before it was published. Not too lengthy, so if you guys wanted to read it, you wouldn't be bored to tears about it. And so we each provide one reading to look at. And what we're going to be doing is discussing, after I've read Dr. Fuller's and he's read mine, conversations about these different readings and their takes on the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
And so each of our discussants will discuss primarily the other person's article, and they'll talk for about 10 minutes, and then the other person will respond for 5 minutes, and then we'll switch articles to discuss the other article. So we're going to flip a coin to figure out which article is going to be discussed first, and I'm going to have Dr. Fuller call it because Dr. Jerryson's from my department. So, and whoever wins the coin toss will do that article first. Is that fine? So the other person will actually talk, right? Okay. Is that?
Yeah.
We're good. Okay. So I'm going to call it.
Yeah, heads. And that is tails.
It's tails.
So, Dr. Jerryson.
So your article we discussed first.
Okay.
So that means you're actually going to talk first.
Oh.
Is that
Oh,
right? Yes, right?
We can flip
You
it
want
around. That's fine. I can go first. That's fine.
Okay.
That's fine.
I don't care.
I'm happy to go first.
All right, I'm just trying to establish some order. You guys can tell me to
I
get
think
stuff
Ed
if
and I
you
both
want.
assume the same thing, so this is fine.
Okay, so you're talking first then.
Yes.
Okay.
So the reading that I'm talking about that Dr. Fuller provided is Bell's The Sensibility of the 60s. Now this reading mostly looks at the issue, I think, of art, the impact of art and how art reflects society during this time period, in which Bell looks at a wide variety of things, from plays to television, to movies, to books, even famous writers, and analyze the ways in which he feels things have gotten for him. He called these aesthetic innovations that were shrill and became, according to him on page 121, harsher forms, even psychotic seizures of certain things. In this way, what I took out of it is that Bell saw a dismantling or a decaying of art in the breakdown in certain ways. And he points a lot of examples of this throughout the readings. What I thought was very interesting in reading this is some of the word choices that he used, like harsh or shrill or psychotic or noise on page 122. Actually, here's an example. On page 122, he says in the beginning, he talks about the sexual perverses as old as Sodom and Gomorrah. As a West scholar, I want to point out, Sodom and Gomorrah is not about sexual perversion, it's about hospitality. That was the big issue. The angels that came to visit Lot were his guests. And because they're guests, with hospitality, you're supposed to be respectful. But the people did not. They wanted to sexually abuse the guests. But we've taken this in a misdirection by reading and thinking it's about sodomy and sexual perversion. And I think here Bell's using that misdirection to also think of this in a wider spray in terms of what he's seen art to do. The Dissolution of Art is one of his first sections on 123. He calls it, and I might be wrong with how to pronounce this, the meretriciousness of it, which means it's apparently attractive but having in reality no value or integrity. And throughout this, he gives a lot of critiques about the art, gives lots of examples. My concern throughout this is this. We have high society and high culture in the United States. We've always had this, and actually all countries have had this. The question is, who is represented in that high society and high culture? It's largely, for me, white people who've been in charge of high society, the art, the music, and so forth, leading up to the current day. And I also think another big issue I have is the fact that art, which Bell also admits is always reflecting reality. I think it's both ways. Art influences reality, reality influences art in both directions. My critique of Bell in this way is that I don't see a big distinction between 1960s and earlier. If we think of, for example, Cubism in the early 1900s, Pablo Picasso, he had a very different take on art. Made it very chaotic, right, with the shapes out of place completely. And in fact, at one point, Bell talks about this sort of development of art, saying we come so far from the caves. But in fact, Pablo Picasso famously said that after looking at the paintings in the caves, he says, we have learned nothing. Indicating, as a famous artist, that the art from the caves is just as sophisticated as it was in the early 1900s. Duchamp's Fountain is an excellent example, too, around early 1900s, using a urinal, turning it upside down, calling it art. This is way before the 1960s. So we've had a lot of art always trying to provoke. In fact, artists have always been challenged to provoke. Even with the Impressionism of the 1800s, always done this. But Bell doesn't seem to fit in this way. He sees the 1960s being distinctly different. I agree with him in that it is different because we have so much taking place in the 1960s. The U.S. war in Vietnam, the Civil Rights Act, women's movements taking place, so society is under a lot of transformation. And I think whenever a country has great transformations, the art will be trying to make sense of it. The artists will be. And we're certainly seeing this here. But when he calls the responses, unique and reactionary overly, he quotes Susan Sontag, I think, at one point on this too, I think he's really pigeonholing what has been a case and pattern throughout art. And that, how much time do I have left?
6 minutes.
Okay, excellent. There's an interesting way too in which he attacks what he calls the Dionysium. On page 139, it's a whole section called the Dionysiac Pack. And by the way, whenever I read I always look to subtitles. They clue me in on the organization of a writer and what they think are important themes. So the subtitles for this reading that we had was the dissolution of art, right? So the dissolution is a breaking down of art. Is the first section. The section was the democratization of genius, which he thinks again is he doesn't see as that great though. What's interesting too is in that section on page 130, he quotes de Tocqueville, who looked at the natural temperament outlook on life. Interestingly enough, de Tocqueville is actually also in the article that I dispersed and is quoted in too, because Alexis Tocqueville visited the United States in the 1800s and was overwhelmed by what he thought was the racism in our country. He came back and wrote voluminously about this. So I find it interesting that Bell's not talking about those issues, but talking about some things that would fit into his argument. Anyway, moving on to the sections though. So we have the loss of self, and so we have in the postmodern period, there is that, right? The idea of thinking beyond the self in this way. The absurdity, which actually generates from the existentialist period, which exists before the 1960s. Jean-Paul Sartre, Camus, and so forth did so much of this in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then we get into the Dionysian pack, page 139. And he says, nowhere was the apocalyptic mood act out more tirelessly in this movement, which called itself Dionysic theater, as the Dionysian pack. And he speaks about it in a bit of, I think, a disdain. Its emphasis on spontaneity and orgasmic release with Eastern mysticism and ritual. Now, one of the things I take a clue to is actually Friedrich Nietzsche, who has been misunderstood in the United States for being anti-Semitic when he hasn't been, but the Nazis made use of him that way. And he always talked about the Dionysian being the actual deeper parts of who we are. It's not the organized, superficial Apollinian that we see here, but the way of blending in, feeling the music, feeling that we're all together, united, the breaking out of the self and seeing that we're all united together in one. And I think this is what the Dionysian pact was trying to get at. It was a sophisticated way of breaking down what they saw as false divisions and trying to get to our deeper nature of who we are. But I don't see that being played out and discussed here. The next section is in the place of reason and the Akota. One thing, of course, I think it's missing throughout this is the philosophy of aesthetics. Which, if we want to talk about art, I think we really have to look at that. Beardsley was famous for this, looking at the fact that art needs to be qualified based on three criteria: unity, complexity, and intensity. And he thought there's a way you could actually accurately qualify and evaluate art in this form, whether it's a movie like Captain Marvel, or if it's a music like Kanye West you're listening to. Beardsley thought that you could do this. And others have done this. But then George Dickey challenged this in the 1980s, saying that art's so subjective, like Duchamp's fountain showed in the 1900s. You can't do this. And I don't see in Bell's discussion any way of entering into the discussion of aesthetics in a way that's already been discussed greatly. And my other concern is trying to think of, we're thinking of art, which is largely now high society, the highly intellectual, which it is, the highly affluent, which it is too. Is that a reflection of the whole United States? So apart from the fact that I think the momentum, the changes taking place, which were tumultuous, might be depicted by the art's only depicting the intellectual, the wealthy, largely white, largely often male, heteronormative often too, depictions of the tumultuosity. And so if we're thinking of the whole United States and whether or not things were changing for a beneficial way, we have to look larger than high society. We have to think of all of society. So I think I have only a couple few minutes left. But if I can, he talks about in 144 at the end in the Akota. He says that in 19th century we are trapped by the mark of decades. And he says the theater has gone stale and the culture masters is now pornotopia. I grew up with Sarah Ruhl, who's considered to be one of the most preeminent playwriters of our generation. She's broken down the fourth wall. She's at Yale, does so many things. Her works are not pornotopia. Her work has been built on the backbone of the 1960s and its work, and she says this too. And he ends by talking about the radicalism of the non-Western world, of China, Algeria, and Cuba, as a puritanical one. and that Marxism is so unionist culture repressive, making the United States just seem so greatly to protect against these vices. But I think it's a false separation.
Okay, so am I talking about his article now?
No, you're going to respond to him.
Responding to
Right.
you.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for your comments. And actually, you focus more on the art than I actually expected. Although this is a chapter that spends a lot of time talking about art and literature, so it certainly makes sense that you did that. But first of all, this is a book chapter in a wider book called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. So his whole point here is that there is no longer a high society. That in fact, this is a cultural form that has taken dominance, taken root as a dominant popular culture throughout all of American and Western society. So it's not an elite that in and of itself is responsible for this, and that it's not simply just these sort of peculiar, provocative artists of some sort of avant-garde variety, but rather the actual cultural form that is popular now in America to be wanting to be shocked, wanting to hear noise, wanting to hear this shrill. That's why he uses this kind of language to describe it, to describe something as a much wider problem than just something that is housed in, some avant-garde art gallery of some sort. So how would you respond to that?
I think it's a good framing. It's helpful for me because I'm not aware of the larger framing of this. And I think you're right. I did focus on art because that was for me the biggest data set that I think that I was working with. For me, and this is something that has been written out a lot when it comes to culture. What is culture? High culture versus low culture. My concern is, like, for example, if we think of like the YouTubers, I like to call it today, or Cardi B, who made it from not high society from other directions. She made it because of opening it up. And the question is this good or bad for society? It sounds like Bell would think it's bad for society. And I don't think people would ever just self-describe the interest they have for art or music as shrill, but I can see high society people thinking it that way.
But his point is that we've democratized genius. That is, in fact, one of the subheadings he has here.
Mm-hmm.
So now we know who's good based on how many YouTube hits they've had.
Good. I think that's great because that then exposes the problem of what is art.
Right.
It's simply who buys, but unfortunately, before this happened, art was simply who paid for it. Like Duchamp showed this by putting a urinal upside down and saying this is art, and people were going to buy it, and they paid lots of money for it. So before it was simply by the fact of how much money you're going to pay, which wealthy people are going to pay for that art or sponsor it that made you big, or after your death. But now you're right, it's not that way. It's through hits or through the masses.
Mm-hmm.
I don't necessarily think that either one's the best way, but I don't see either one as being better than the other.
Why not?
Because if we think about artists and where they come from, many of them don't come from very wealthy beginnings. And if we allow wealth to determine the expression of art, then we're only letting part of society to begin to determine the exposure of the rest of society to that expression.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, wealth does not necessarily mean high acumen or intelligence. You could be a trust fund baby and have tons of money. You could be part of the aristocrat, which was quite some time in Europe too. It's passed down from generation to generation. You could have been very intelligent when it comes to engineering, but not when it comes to art. So that's not necessarily a good way to, I think, only allow it. If we think about the changes in politics today, for example, where people are trying to push more for small donations instead of large ones, that's a democratization too in some ways. And I don't think that is dangerous, but I see it as just different and perhaps helpful in trying to avoid few people making decisions for the whole.
I think also the problem is that we can't just think of this in terms of class and wealth. That there's a much broader, much larger problem going on here, and that these are not the only two alternatives that we have. Prior to the 1960s, the film industry, I can't really weigh in all that much on the paintings and the sculpture, but I know a fair amount about the film industry. So prior to the 60s, the film industry self-censored. Like they had their own policies on what they considered to be responsible to show in films, right? And maybe they went too far with a lot of it, maybe they didn't. But when you compare and contrast films that were made prior to the 1960s with those that are made during and after the 1960s, you get a completely different kind of way in which things are presented. And Bell touches on a lot of this. And the older way, the prior to the 1960s, seemed to me the kind that actually presented the real human problems, the real soul of what actually goes on in everyday life, and explored the morality of given problems, and also because of the limited nature of what they were allowed to do, allowed or required the directors and the actors and everyone else on the crew and the writers to actually use more of their imagination, right? Rather than just go for the easiest, the basest shock value. To give you kind of an example of what I'm talking about, like you compare, for example, a film on that deals with some sort of romantic couple, like a romance, right? I mean, today's romance film is usually very formulaic. You know, they meet each other, and then you know that this was a successful date because now they're sleeping with each other, right? And then the next day, somehow or another, maybe they're still sleeping with each other, and then a few days later, something happens and they're no longer happy with each other, like they had some kind of an argument. And you know that they're not happy with each other because they're not sleeping with each other anymore. Then eventually, at a certain point, they make up, and you know that they've made up because they're sleeping with each other again. That's exactly what films do now. Take something like, say, The Thin Man, right? Okay. With William Powell and Myrna Loy. They never sleep with each other in the film until the very end, right, where you know that they're about to. Right? At the very end, they get on the same berth in the train leaving, and he makes it very clear that you know exactly what's going to happen as soon as the credits start rolling. But because they leave that to your imagination, they're able to use the film to actually explore what it is that these two people like about each other and why they love each other so much. So there's soul involved. And I think the 60s erased a lot of that. So that's what I'm getting at, and I think that's the sort of thing Bell is talking about.
I see. That's helpful too. And I think there's some good points here. We can see in Hollywood today that oftentimes the lower budget films don't make it. They're playing for the larger audiences. It's sometimes not very sophisticated. They're using things that just work. The last big, for me, guy like fantasy, Wachowski siblings, the Jupiter Rising, and they wrote it themselves, they directed themselves. It's supposed to be a sort of way of seeing if a unique thing could make it without having a backing like Star Wars or Marvel, and it crashed. And I think you're right, there is a formula. I would say that there's always been formulas in this stuff, but I think you're seeing more formulaic when you get the larger masses.
The formulas I'm necessarily concerned
about.
But
the sexuality is something I want to get to here, though, like you're saying.
And violence is too a lot of part of it.
So I think you're right that we've seen an erosion of the restrictions. I would say, but this is a part of art. Art's always trying to push the boundaries. That's part of what the artist is trying to do. They're always trying to push. And I think it's inevitable to see it pushing, breaking away with violence and with sex. And I don't necessarily think it's good or bad. Well, sex, I actually think it's good. Michel Foucault wrote that the Victorian era and all this repression of sexuality we did just pushed sexuality underground in the different forms of doing things and actually exacerbated it. But we're more open about it, more accepting about it. This will reduce the dark, backwards ways of what we do in the back room. And so I'm less concerned about sexual, but I would agree with you about violence. And the idea, too, I'm concerned with these days is my daughter, who's 13, or my son, who's 8, can just go on to YouTube and watch what they want, or look at porn on their friend's phone. That's a problem, absolutely. And I think it requires regulation. But I think if we're going to call the 1960s the culprit for it, I would say, again, it's part of a trend in which art's always pushing the boundaries, and as the film industry got more and more money, and you got wire audiences, just a form of capitalism, you're always going to have this issue with capitalism with the larger masses, issues of appealing to that larger crowd and less to the ones that have been.
So it's only a coincidence that this happened at the very time that there was this pushback against the static conformity of our first half of the 20th century?
I think you're right in that you gained pushback in 1960s, but Charlie Chaplin pushed back as well, even before there was actually a voice.
Yeah.
So you're always having pushback, but there was more money in the 60s by that point. Hollywood had already gotten bigger enough to begin to push this, and the intensity of pushing back, you're right, was intense then.
Go ahead and switch.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and switch.
And we'll open up the Q&A for everyone afterwards.
Sure. Okay, so I had actually not been familiar with the Ronald Takaki piece. However, I did notice that this article, Reflections on Racial Patterns in America, is included in his textbook, which is a reader on diversity and the issues of diversity, which he actually has alongside the Nathan Glazer article. What's that? 1982, thank you. Sort of contrasted with the Nathan Glazer article. He formats his article largely around the Nathan Glazer article, which is actually an excerpt from Nathan Glazer's book, Affirmative Discrimination, which came out in 1965, in which Glazer criticizes the quota system that came from the 1960s Civil Rights Acts. And Glazer, in the book, calls for a colorblind society and argues that affirmative action interferes with the promise of a colorblind society, which is what he thought that the whole emphasis of the 1960s should have been. First of all, when I get to that, let me just preface this by saying that I don't, in this conversation about the 1960s counterculture, don't really have much of a problem with the civil rights aspects of it. I think that those were mostly positive. I have some criticisms of some of the Civil Rights Acts. There were provisions within them, but for the most part, I think that they were very good and very important for America. The real problem, I think the biggest problem with the Civil Rights Act, although I am sympathetic to some of the states' rights arguments about it, but I don't endorse those arguments. I'm just understanding what they have to say. But the biggest, I think, concern about the Civil Rights Acts is the creation of the idea of the protected class, which is what I think creates racial and ethnic divisions in America that are unnecessary. When you group people into protective classes and then everybody else is not protected, not part of that protected class, creates these kind of unnecessary group distinctions and divisions and creates all kinds of bitterness and opposition towards one another, which I think exacerbates the problem of preventing us from having a colorblind society. And I think that's largely what Nathan Glazer's point was in affirmative discrimination, which he came out with in 1975. And everybody, I think we all want to have a colorblind society. You and I both do. The big difference between the left and the right on this is that the left doesn't believe that we're quite ready yet to have a truly colorblind society until we repair, past injustices and deal with, reparations and make sure that we prepare our society for color blindness. Whereas I think the right would argue that we're ready for color blindness right now, and that what we have to do is focus on the primacy of the individual over the group, right? Let's stop thinking in terms of groups and classes and dividing ourselves and separating ourselves out into these divisions, but rather think in terms of the smallest minority. I'm not an Ayn Rand fan, but she did say, which I think is accurate, is that the smallest minority is the individual. So focus on that smallest minority, and we can move ahead. And it's interesting that he's talking about Nathan Glazer and the affirmative discrimination book. Now, obviously, this article that Takaki wrote came out in 1982. But Nathan Glazer himself, who, by the way, I interviewed him about 10, 15 years ago, and he just died a couple of months ago, sadly. I don't know if you knew that or not. But Nathan Glazer, it was a consummate scholar in the purest sense, in that he constantly changed his mind about things, right? When he was confronted with new evidence and saw new problems that had to be solved maybe in older ways or newer ways. So by 1997, he actually changed his mind about affirmative action and came out in support of affirmative action in a book that he wrote called We Are All Multiculturalists Now. Right? And in that book, he actually makes a very different kind of case for affirmative action than you normally hear. His argument is that this multiculturalism of separating everybody into all of these different classes and groups and whatnot, which creates these divisions, make it impossible for these different groups and ethnicities and races and whatnot to ever meet each other. So they all are constantly, it just perpetuates segregation even further. So his argument by 97 was that the only way to repair this problem is to have affirmative action so that we can actually bring racial and ethnic minorities into white places so that they're not segregated out. That we should not necessarily just say support the black business, right? Let's support the business that has whites and blacks, right? That are working together side by side. So he changes his mind about that. Not that I necessarily agree with him on the matter of policy, but I agree with him about the problem, right? Not necessarily on the solution. I haven't really formed a full opinion on that one, though. But another thing about the Takaki book is that he talks quite a lot about Tocqueville, and you brought that out in your comments about the Bell piece. And he uses Tocqueville to describe sort of as a backdrop against Glazer's argument. Because Glazer's argument here is that America, he has an optimistic perspective on American history, is not really quite as racist as intellectuals today make it sound like. And so he's trying to be optimistic and sort of glorify America and make it look like a much more promising place. And in, We Are All Multiculturalists Now, he actually cites Takaki and says, well, these things are open to interpretation. I was just trying to be an optimist, really, about America. But the Tocqueville part that Takaki brings in, obviously Tocqueville came to America and saw all kinds of mistreatment of minorities. And Takaki cites a lot of those quotes directly from Tocqueville's Democracy in America. I think the real problem here is Takaki's use of Tocqueville. I think it's a misunderstanding of Tocqueville. Tocqueville was not saying that America is uniquely racist, or America is uniquely bigoted, or America is uniquely discriminatory, or America uniquely mistreats its minorities. His argument actually was that this is a common thing throughout the world, because it is this kind of bigotry is human nature. What he was interested in when he came to America is American egalitarianism. His hope was that when he came to America, a country based on equality, that actually puts in their Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal, his hope was that we would not have this kind of bigotry here as he sees it in Europe. But we do have it, right? So he's interested in exactly how that is, that irony. That on one hand, we have this egalitarian spirit, and on the other hand, we have all this bigotry. How do we square the two? And Tocqueville's whole point is that it's actually American egalitarianism that creates this kind of bigotry in an ironic, roundabout way. So American egalitarianism creates a static conformity, because egalitarianism means that nobody's of a greater status than another, meaning that nobody's opinion is of greater status than another. And so this all comes back to Bell's point, really, because because egalitarianism is our spirit, we democratize what's right and wrong. We democratize good and bad. We democratize things. And so the majority now gets to decide these things. So the majority ends up mistreating the minority. People who aren't the same sees things differently. And he spends a lot of Democracy in America talking about a lot of different ways in which this is seen in America. It's probably the best book ever written by a non-American about the United States, right? But he does, in fact, he does focus on this one, on this aspect also of how this leads to mistreatment of minorities. So there's definitely that. So I would just say that I think in a way that Takaki uses in an abusive way Tocqueville. There's much more going on in Tocqueville. We can't use Tocqueville as a history book, right? Tocqueville is making a case about American political thought from a foreigner's perspective. So I think that has to be taken into consideration. And this, Tocqueville helps us a lot here. And Tocqueville's a figure that I think is useful to both the left and the right. Like the left and the right both find something in Tocqueville that is interesting to both sides of the political spectrum. So he's diverse in that. So am I out of time?
I mean, technically.
Okay. All right. But let me just conclude with how I think Tocqueville helps us to understand where we're at now. Because I think what happened in the 1960s was kind of the replacement of this old static conformity with a new one, with the sort of counterculture against that. And as we've replaced it with something inherently different, right? It's not that we didn't have this majority before, but the content and character of it has changed, but not for the better. That's my position.
Thank you, Ben. I think it's really interesting too, like you're saying, that Tocqueville's used at both sides. It's almost like Adam Smith.
Kind of.
Adam Smith's for idea of capitalism has so much on both sides. I want to first discuss the question of context with this. So, like you did with Bell. So, Ronald Pataki was the founder of ethnic studies in the United States. So we think, which we don't have quite, unfortunately. But in the 1970s, it was really important. And what he aimed to do was to show what he thought was a pattern. So, the Naturalization Act of 1790 made it so that any of the rights that we have under our Constitution and the Bill of Rights was only open to free whites and implicitly men. This was done, in the next year, 1791, we ratified our Bill of Rights. So this restriction was made prior to the exercising of this egalitarianism. And during the early 1800s, we had three races, red, white, and black. This is where Irish are brought in, Italian are brought in, they're called as red or black, by the way. They had to lobby to become seen as white. And we have the camps and the mistreatment of Native Americans this time too. So I think you're right that he saw problems with this sort of egalitarianism. My take is that he saw it as a superficial one because we weren't really practicing it. Even when we had the 13th Amendment, which was to guarantee after the Civil War that we were not going to have slaves anymore, we allowed slaves if they created a felony. And that's an exception. To which, shortly after doing this 13th Amendment, many states in the South created laws saying if you jaywalk, it's a felony. We could arrest you and put you back in indentured servitude. So this was during a time period that Tocqueville was visiting the United States and was witnessing and saying, this doesn't match. The verbiage you're saying here of egalitarian is not matching what the states, the government is doing, how to treat its people. And I see this persisting because we have the Chinese building the railroads in the late 1800s and they're then kicked away from the country, right? We have the Japanese and the South Asians trying to vie for whiteness or gain full rights, basically what they want to do by that. The Supreme Court saying no. It wasn't until 1964, Civil Rights Act, we also had this sort of Immigration Act that was called the Great Brain Drain because we pulled all these great people from around the world, doctors, lawyers, someone allowed them to come to this country the first time. A lot of them had to work as taxi drivers though. But there's a huge influx of educated people in the United States and people that generally were not permitted before. And this changed definitely the demographics of this country. And it was destabilizing, absolutely. My issue is that the only destabilization took place for those who had power before, which were the whites. And whites are now becoming a minority in this country. It's fearful for that, for many people who are white to have this. And then the other
It's fearful for what? I'm sorry, I missed that.
the fearing this loss of majority status. They just did a poll, USA Today just this last week, saying that 47% of whites today think that the white population becoming a minority means we're losing our values in the United States. 47%. So this is, I think, showing and showcasing this sort of persistence of white fragility, I like to call it. And I think you're right about the idea of having to avoid silo effects. That's something, by the way, our president's been talking about with me, with the Women's Center. Is if you're a Women's Center, you're siloing women. And if you're multicultural, you're siloing people. We should have the whole university become safe. And I said to him, look, when you have minorities, we have the lowest graduation rate for black students in the country, pretty much. Or like less than 8%, like 8% we have for graduation rate for African-American students. And we have racism right now, too. And we have women being sexually assaulted. When you have minorities that are being mistreated, the first thing you do is make them feel safe and feel like they have an advocate. And then once you have that, then you begin to build bridges. But you can't build bridges until you win them over to feel like they have some advocacy, that they are being heard. And we're not doing this here. So I agree that we don't want to silo it. And I also have problems with multiculturalism too, because multiculturalism just says, we're all different but equal. And I'm like, no. If you look at the census, just for the entire country, the household incomes for blacks versus whites, it's always been down. 1990s was high for every single group but black households. And we don't pay heed to these distinctions as a problem. And this is where I'll tie this to Bell, because we can see in the 1970s, Stan Lee and others created these ideas through comic books of the Black Panther, right? Which was based off the civil rights movement. And now today we have a movie that made a big Black Panther, which just showcased, I think, fantastic visions of black culture that was never there before. I'm almost done.
Well, that's 5 minutes, but I think you guys went 10 minutes before, so if the
I'll
conversation's going, it's going, you know.
I'll just end with one last thing, which is that we commonly say that justice is blind, colorblind. But blindness, I think, is two ways. You're blind to the people there, but you're also blind to the biases. So, for example, in jury selection, they found through statistics the most common juror that's allowed by the prosecutor and the defense attorney is the white man. Because the black person is assumed to have a bias, the woman is assumed to be sympathetic. So the most common ways of dismissing, because each attorneys get to dismiss so many, have been the minorities and not the white male. But justice is blind. It doesn't pay heed to this. So we have to be careful of blindness, because it often overlooks mistreatment.
But part of that implicit bias that white people tend to have more often are assumptions about the experience of non-whites, right? So there is an assumption that non-whites want to be protected, right? Which is not necessarily the case, right? That, for example, there was an article just in the New York Times a couple of days ago, a really good article, Americans are divided by their views on race, not race itself. It's a crucial difference and grounds for optimism. But one of the interesting charts that it had here, based on the polling data that they had over time, from 94 to 2016, it found actually that asking African Americans if they should have special favors in order to deal with past injustices, only 32% said yes, right? And among white liberals, it's 46% that said yes, which is a significantly higher percentage, right? And actually, it's gone the other direction. Like at one point in 2007 or so, the black response to that was like 25%. It's gone up slightly, but it's kind of stabilized at that point. What do you make of those kind of numbers?
I think those are very interesting. I guess reparations is a whole other category for me. My concern is...
Well, this isn't just about reparations. This is about quotas.
Right, I mean...
Safe spaces, all of those kinds of things. Are they really, are minorities really asking for these things?
Well, I think for me, I'm less concerned about who's asking and if it's more about who deserves it. Because, for example, I worked with the first black nurse ever in Florida, and she was a teaching assistant with me when I was in my last college. She could never speak up on things. I always tried to encourage her. She was in her 60s, late 60s, she had retired. But there was this sort of culture of beating her down, of being respectful to the white man, of not asking too much. And to be in this our society, it's almost like you have to keep your head down. And so I'm worried when we're asking about quotas and things, and we're asking people who are marginalized or already feeling oppressed, how free they are to speak this way. But for me, the issue is greater, do they deserve it? So we've had a rise in redlining, right, recently, with redlining being allowing people who are not disallow people who are not white to get mortgages, which was started, by the way, after World War II. The whole idea of suburbs was created with the GI Bill, which privileged white people and disallowed people who are non-white to get certain houses in certain areas. And we're perpetuating this even now. Like, I bought a house 2 years ago here in Ohio, and they said that we must put down your race. If you don't give it to us, we have to guess it. And then they redlined with that. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Act of 1965, the Immigration Act in the time period began to break this down, but we see a repealing of this in the 1980s, early 1980s, all this. And so I think, for me, I see a growth of incarceration of blacks under Clinton exponentially. So I think, for me, it's both houses are problematic for me. I mean, the Democrats, by the way, create superdelegates because they were fearful in the 1970s the blacks overtake their party.
Right, yeah.
So
Yet they're against the Electoral College now.
Right. So, I mean, there's so much racism embedded in our political system, in our parties, and I think it's hard when we're living in a society that's so saturated this to ask the marginalized to give voice to their needs without just looking at the needs itself.
Okay, but you use the word deserve. Like that word means that they've somebody's earned something. That's what deserving means. Like, do you mean that instead that who needs it rather than who deserves it?
That's a good qualifier. By deserve, I think about basic human rights. I think we all deserve basic human rights. Adequate housing, adequate access to food, to medicine, to education. And if you look at, for example, just to the inner states of Youngstown, we can see that the blacks certainly don't get the same education as the nice suburbs of Poland and Canfield and so forth. And you had the white flight 1990s. So for me, it's more about this idea of it being equal, we'd say equal opportunity. That means it assumes that there's an equal beginning point to get that opportunity. Some people don't get the same equal beginning point.
I think that our mutual desire for the same end point is the same. I think it's more a matter of means.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah. Or is this the point where
So yeah, so say we've got about 15 minutes, a little less than 15 minutes. So if anybody has any questions that they want to jump in, I'll try and keep track of.
Please, nothing will be offensive. It's important for us to talk about these things. Please.
I saw Emerson back there first.
All right. So, not your question, stand for anything. So my question was, how much is the modern culture because of the United States, which you said, a direct successor to what the culture was forming in the 60s versus how much it's evolved into more of its own distinct feature, so to speak?
I'm not sure that I'm not quite following your question.
Okay. So, we had, as we just titled this one, is the sensibility of the 60s. So how much is the modern sensibilities of 2019, 2015, et cetera, how much is that directly descended from the sensibilities of the 60s versus having become its own creature?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. Well, since it's my meeting, I'll take it. It's, well, obviously Daniel Bell isn't here now to answer that question, but I would say, and he would probably agree, that it's the same, that it is an outgrowth of this change in our sensibilities that began in the 1960s. It may have changed the content of it, but it's still emanating from the same thing, from the same lack of restraint. Like art is about the lack of restraint now. That, these are the kinds of things that appeal to people. I mean, it's the best way I can answer that question. It's an outgrowth of the 60s.
I mean, I would add to that too. What historians often argue about is that periodization. How do we divide up history? Do we create centuries? Do we create around wars? Do we create around environment? Because this is a very subjective thing.
Right. And
so the question is, like I think you're pointing to, is this causation that's being implied here, is it direct or not? Is the 1960s a part of what's happened before that led to this point? Is the 70s and 80s that destabilized to this? I can say this though. We see changes in the Democratic and Republican parties starting in the 1960s. When the civil rights happened, you had the white Dixiecrats that left, went to the Republican Party. Women's movement in the 1970s, they left, went to the Republican Party. So we're seeing a changing of demographics in these parties that I would say, although there's always been changes throughout our country, but
even evangelicals were Democrats and they moved to the Republican Party.
So we had a very drastic, quick changeover over our political systems, our two-party systems, which historically has always been fluid, but dramatically changed from the 1960s onward to less than what we are now, which I think is people who are very one-minded in each camp now, instead of the diversity that used to be there before.
I had a question for Dr. Fuller, actually. Do you think you could elaborate more on your opinions on when you were talking about the film industry? Because you give this example.
On what?
When you were talking about the
Film industry, yes.
You gave this example about a romantic film,
Yeah.
I think in the 50s, and how it had soul in it, and then these later films don't have it. But I think that, I'm a film major myself.
Okay.
You're ignoring a lot of great pieces of art that have come since, like just, Woody Allen made a lot of romantic comedies that are widely acclaimed. There was a film in 2009 which was called 500 Days of Summer, which is also a romantic film, which I personally think that had a lot of soul, if you will. I just wondering, do you think you could elaborate more on that? Because there's been a lot of great films since the 60s. It hasn't just, not everything great is before the...
Well, Woody, I'm not familiar with this latest film that you're talking about, but Woody Allen's movies are all about the absurdity of romance. He makes comedy out of it. In fact, he does, I think, take the soul out of it. He always plays a guy that's incapable of remaining in some sort of healthy relationship. Like he's someone that is kind of like a Saul Bellow Herzog kind of character, in just about all of his movies. Somebody that's got all these kind of tremendous psychological problems that just for some reason is consumed with self and is like exactly the problem that Daniel Bell is referring to. This obsession with self and one's own problems that he's always incapable of looking beyond himself and his own needs. It's a common theme in these movies. So I would think, if anything, that kind of reinforces the same problem that we see in that shift. However, I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to universalize the problem. There are, I'm sure, many exceptions that we could see. Like, I've seen movies made within the last 10, 15 years that could have easily been made in the 1940s, right? So that, of course, does, in fact, play into it. So it's not, it's not a 100% universal constant. There are always exceptions to everything.
If I could, go ahead. Thank you. So what do you think of, like, have you seen Before Sunrise, Before Sunset?
Is that a Woody Allen?
No, there's a trilogy with Ethan Hawke in it.
No, I haven't.
It's a beautiful romance about two people riding on a train in Europe, meeting each other. There's no real sexuality in it, but there's implied. It's a very, I think, well reviewed, and it's so popular. It had 3 editions of it. And I'm thinking of things like Frozen, which, while it's Disney, they avoided the natural formula of the male and the female coming together, right? They highlighted sisterhood, which I didn't see happening before 1960s this way.
Which film?
Frozen.
Frozen.
It's a Disney film. My kids watch it, but this is the thing too. When we look at young kids, right, and what's impacting them, what's values you're giving. My daughter, when she was growing up, was always worried about the fact there's always the girl chasing after the guy. What kind of heroine could be empowered in this way? But we're beginning to see these movies now showing, like Captain Marvel, women who are not sexualized. They don't have to be romantic. They can have different roles, which they didn't really have prior to the 1960s in such a way, in such a pattern. And so it's, in many ways, they're breaking the mold then, aren't they? And they're enlarging it for other people who weren't ever being able to feel part of it, now being drawn into it.
I would say that that's true, but it's not necessary. I don't think that is necessarily a break that we see happen in the 1960s. Prior to the 60s, there were the kind of roles for women that are kind of what you described. Not exactly the same as to the extent that we now see women in films that are working in corporations alongside men or politicians in the same sense. That none of that arose yet. But like take John Wayne movies for example. John Wayne was always paired up with a woman who was his equal in these films, and I don't know whether he insisted on that behind the scenes or not, but that's always how it worked out. Like he would always have. He paired up with Maureen O'Hara a lot. Right? A woman that talked back to him, that spoke back, a woman that stood up to him in a way that none of the other men in the movies were able to.
Right.
Right. And so I think you got that even before the 60s. You're right, though, that the way in which women were portrayed, especially in children's films and children's TV shows, were incredibly sexist prior to the 60s.
What about the race? Because I'm thinking of
What?
5 by 5.
I mean, Breakfast at Tiffany's. I think about, or like,
Which is a racist film with the Mickey Rooney
Mickey
character.
right?
Yeah.
But they talk about the fact that when you're breaking down stereotypes, where it was mostly white, well, it's really hard unless you got the martial arts films. It was very hard for Asian Americans, Black Americans to, except for Late for Dinner was a big breakthrough, right? I think that was the 1960s, wasn't it?
You mean Guess Who's Coming to
Guess,
Dinner?
thank you. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. I mean, so you began to open things up. So while it was racist to have a white person play a very stereotypical Asian American, you finally had Asianness in there, and people talk about the fact that it was horribly racist, but you began to have an opening. When you began to start playing the beauty in it now too, and they began to have ancillary roles, and they began to finally have starring roles. Like we just had Crazy Rich Asians, which is not, by the way, I think a really intellectual film. But it's the first time we've ever had a Hollywood blockbuster showcase a whole Asian cast in such a way before, aside from Joy Luck Club. So I think all these things came out of the 1960s breaking the mold in some ways, and allowing for other people to participate.
I don't have any disagreement with you about this. I mean,
Okay.
I think that it was a good thing that we broke that mold and we were able to include more religions and more ethnicities and more races. Even Jews, for example, prior to this period, they never even told anyone in their audiences that they were Jewish. Like Jack Benny was never Jewish, right? The Three Stooges were never Jewish, right? Until years later when suddenly you found out that actually the Stooges' real name was Horowitz. You know, so yeah, I mean, I think that you're right about that. Okay, but I think the overall point that Bell is making is still true. We have any
Time for another quick, about 3 minutes.
I was wondering if you could possibly elaborate on when you
Oh,
were
both of
talking.
us, or which one?
I guess it would encompass both. When you were talking about like the differences between something that is earned or something that is deserved.
Well, I mean, for me, the terms are synonymous. So, Dr. Jerryson, what do you?
Sure. One of the problems I've had with white rhetoric is the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps. This term's been used a lot to imply that with hard work you'll succeed. The pursuit of happiness with Will Smith was, I think, emblematic of that. The problem with that is that while you anecdotally have people who can survive and do well, but working really hard, I know a ton of people work hard and don't succeed. And you have so much more privilege being white, being male. You don't have to work as hard for it. And so just giving the rhetoric place by your bootstraps, you earned it, dismisses the more trouble, the more difficulty. I mean, we have so many statistics about how many times with resumes you'll send it out where you just change a name from a white name to Jamal Jones, and it changes by like 15 times the rate for having to apply to get a job call back. So when it's that, and the same CV's in there, it suggests, no, it's not just about what you've earned, because how do you equate that when you have to work hard for certain things? It's about, I think, what we all deserve at the beginning. And if we don't have at the beginning, how we can make that more equitable.
My problem is with the concept of privilege, though. I mean, again, this harkens back to the point about pigeonholing people into different classes. The problem I have with the idea of privilege is that I think everybody has disadvantages. Not a single person is walking around in this world with a major disadvantage that's in some way a major challenge to their success. Now, if you are a minority, that's obviously one of the things that is holding you back, right? But I think even, white men all white men have something. I had something, we all do, right? Which is why I think it makes more sense to look at people as individuals and encapsulate what exactly is them, their personality, their life, their experience. Obviously, a person's first name and last name is part of it too, so that goes on a CV.
And I'll just end with this saying, I agree that English is important, but if you don't look at patterns, you won't be able to see ways in which some people might be neglected, not because of individuality, but how we see them.
If I could,
Yeah.
so there's a lot of discussion about civility and how we need to focus on civility and engage in civil discourse, and there's not a lot of discussion about what that actually amounts to. And oftentimes, civility gets reduced to politeness or following proper etiquette, which I think is a huge mistake to civility. And it's worth thinking about what civility actually means, and whatever definition I think you come up with, I think one of the things we should all be recognizing is that this discussion we just had it was a great example, and where you could see them actually truly listening to each other and then giving when we recognize, oh, the other person's right about something, and so that's something that we should all actually learn from and get better at. And I think we all should thank Drs. Jerryson and Fuller for having this conversation and finding us all to be a part of it. So thank you very much, guys.